Which one of you is my wife?" The rancher's voice cracked as three identical faces stared back at him, each wearing the same blue traveling dress, each carrying the same worn leather satchel, each with eyes that held the same mixture of defiance and desperation. The train whistle screamed behind them. One simple mail-order arrangement had just become the most complicated decision of his life, and the entire town was watching. "I am Emma Morrison, your intended bride." The words hung in the dust, laden air like a challenge thrown down before God, and every soul gathered at Millfield Station. Jacob's weathered hands trembled as he stared at three identical faces, each framed by the same chestnut curls escaping from travel-worn bonnets, each pair of green eyes holding secrets he couldn't begin to fathom. The woman who spoke stepped forward with shoulders squared, but her sisters moved with her, a choreographed dance of protection that spoke of years defending each other against a world determined to break them apart. "These are my sisters, Sarah and Clara." Her voice never wavered, though Jacob caught the slight tremor in her hands as she smoothed her blue traveling dress. Behind them, the locomotive hissed steam like a dragon releasing its captives, and the gathered townspeople pressed closer, their whispers creating a symphony of scandal that made Jacob's ears burn with embarrassment and something else he couldn't name. Mrs. Henderson clutched her pearls. Old Pete removed his hat. The banker Morrison stepped from the crowd with predatory interest gleaming in his cold eyes, and Jacob felt the first stirring of protective instinct he'd experienced since the war took his brother. "Our father." Emma's voice cracked just once before steel returned to her spine. "Our father made arrangements for all three of us. We understand if this complicates your plans, Mr. Brennan, but we will not be separated." Sarah, slightly taller with ink-stained fingers, nodded sharply. Clara, the quietest one with observant eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail, simply watched Jacob's face with an intensity that made him feel exposed, vulnerable, seen in ways no woman had ever bothered to look. His modest ranch house flashed through his mind. One bedroom, one kitchen table with two chairs, one life planned for solitude broken only by occasional companionship. Three women meant three futures depending on his next words. Three hearts beating with the rhythm of shared desperation masked as defiance. The crowd pressed closer, hungry for drama, for the moment when propriety would demand he choose one sister and abandon two to whatever fate awaited unclaimed women in a territory where survival meant finding protection or perishing alone. Emma lifted her chin higher, and Jacob saw past the fear to something magnificent and terrible. A woman who would fight for her family with her last breath, who would stand between her sisters and harm even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. In that moment, watching three identical faces reflecting three variations of courage, Jacob Brennan made a decision that would transform not just 4 lives, but an entire town's understanding of what family could mean when love replaced convention as the foundation for everything that mattered most in this harsh and beautiful world. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now, let's continue. I need time to sort this out properly. Jacob's declaration silenced the crowd's murmurs, though he caught Morrison's sharp glance and Mrs. Henderson's scandalized gasp as he loaded 3 worn satchels into his wagon bed. The ride to his ranch stretched in comfortable silence, broken only by creaking wheels and the sisters' synchronized breathing, a rhythm that spoke of years sleeping in shared beds, sharing meager meals, moving through life as one organism with 3 hearts. His bachelor cabin looked smaller somehow, with 4 people approaching its weathered door. But Emma stepped forward first, her hands already assessing the cluttered interior with the practiced eye of a woman who had made homes from nothing more than determination and love. Within hours, Jakob found himself mesmerized by their wordless choreography. Emma at his rusty stove, somehow coaxing flames that had never burned evenly for him, while Sarah settled at his rickety table with his torn shirts, her needle flying through fabric with the precision of someone who had mended hope back together countless times. Clara moved through his scattered belongings like a gentle storm, creating order from chaos without disturbing the essential character of his rough-hewn space. They never spoke directions to each other, never bumped elbows or stepped on toes, flowing around his cabin like water finding its natural course through stone. Jakob retreated to his porch, ostensibly to give them room but secretly to process the strange ache blooming in his chest as he watched his lonely house transform into something he had never dared imagine. Home. As evening shadows stretched across his land, lamplight spilled through windows that had stayed dark for 3 years since his brother's death, and he saw them clearly for the first time as individuals rather than identical mysteries. Emma hummed while she stirred something that smelled like heaven, her voice carrying melodies that made his heart remember music existed. Sarah's laughter sparkled over some private joke she shared with Clara. Her wit sharp enough to cut glass, but never cruel. Intelligence dancing in eyes that had seen too much hardship to remain naive about the world's capacity for both beauty and brutality. Clara spoke least, but moved with purpose, her quiet observations revealing depths that made Jakob suspect she understood more about people's hearts than they understood about themselves. The cabin filled with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in his stone hearth, and everything to do with the way 3 women had chosen to trust him with their safety, their secrets, their synchronized souls that somehow made perfect sense of his scattered life. When Emma brought him coffee on the porch, her fingers brushed his for just a moment, but he felt the touch echo through his entire body, like recognition of something he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting at all. Brennan, this disgraceful arrangement ends today. Morrison's voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk, his polished boots clicking against Jakob's porch boards with the rhythm of a man accustomed to owning everything he touched. The banker's cold eyes swept over the transformed cabin where curtains now framed windows, where the scent of fresh bread drifted through air that had known only loneliness for years, where 3 women had somehow made Jakob's rough shelter feel like sanctuary. Morrison's lips curved in a smile that held no warmth, only the satisfaction of a predator cornering wounded prey. Choose one bride immediately, or I'll foreclose on this property for moral impropriety and violation of territorial decency standards. His words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of fear that Jakob felt in his bones, but something else stirred too, a protective fury he hadn't experienced since watching his brother fall to Confederate bullets. Morrison stepped closer, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the honest work clothes Jakob wore, his manicured hands soft where Jakob's were scarred by years of building something real from nothing. Your water rights alone are worth 3 times what you owe, Brennan, and certain parties are very interested in acquiring them through legitimate foreclosure proceedings. The threat hung between them like smoke, acrid and choking, while inside the cabin Jakob could hear the sisters moving with their usual synchronized grace, unaware that their newfound safety balanced on the edge of Morrison's greed. Emma appeared in the doorway, her face pale but composed, her hands clasped so tightly Jakob could see white knuckles betraying the calm she projected like armor against the world's cruelty. "Mr. Morrison." Her voice carried the careful politeness of a woman who had learned to navigate dangerous men through diplomacy rather than defiance. "Perhaps we should discuss this situation." Morrison's laugh scraped like fingernails against Jakob's soul as he realized the banker's presence here, now, was no coincidence. "Your father was most cooperative once he understood the consequences of his gambling debts, Miss Morrison. 3 daughters for the price of 1 seemed like excellent collateral for his unfortunate losses." The words hit Emma like physical blows. her composure cracking just enough for Jakob to see the pain she carried like stones in her heart, the burden of being sold like livestock to pay another man's debts. Sarah and Clara flanked their sister instantly, their movement so swift and protective Jakob understood these women had survived by being each other's shields against a world determined to break them apart. "We'll leave immediately," Emma whispered, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "We won't let our presence cost you your home, Mr. Brennan." But Jacob saw how her hands shook with suppressed grief, how her sisters' faces reflected the same desperate acceptance of displacement they had carried like scars since childhood, and something crystallized in his chest. The absolute certainty that no power on earth would make him abandon these women to Morrison's calculated cruelty, even if defending them cost him everything he had built. Thunder rolled across the prairie like God's own judgment as Jacob led the sisters into his barn, the storm's fury matching the tempest building in his chest since Morrison's departure. Rain hammered the roof in staccato bursts while lightning split the darkness, revealing faces etched with the kind of pain that comes from discovering the depths of human evil disguised as respectability. Clara moved to the old grain bin where she had hidden something during their first day, her quiet hands producing a bundle of letters wrapped in oilcloth with the careful precision of someone who understood evidence must be preserved against those who would destroy truth to protect their crimes. "We suspected," she said, her voice steady despite the way lightning illuminated tears she refused to shed, but suspicion and proof are different things entirely. The letters crackled like dry leaves as she spread them across Jakob's workbench, each page revealing another family destroyed, another woman sold into desperation, another man pressured into surrendering land that held water, minerals, railroad access. Sarah's ink-stained fingers traced the banker's signature across document after document, her mathematical mind calculating the scope of Morrison's empire built on human suffering. 23 families in Millfield County alone, she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated injustice. 47, across 3 territories. Emma stood beside Jakob, close enough that he could feel her trembling with rage she had never been allowed to express, close enough that her whispered words burned against his ear like brands. "Our younger sisters, Mary and Beth, are 8 and 10. After Papa's last business deal with Morrison, we had enough food for maybe 2 weeks. Lightning crashed again, illuminating her face, transformed by fury into something magnificent and terrible. A woman who had been pushed beyond endurance into the realm where angels become warriors. Jakob studied the letters, seeing pattern after pattern. Fathers with gambling debts, widows with mortgages, desperate men offered marriage arrangements that came with impossible conditions designed to fail. Morrison had turned human need into a weapon, love into leverage, survival into surrender. He orchestrated all of it, Jacob said, the words tasting like ashes. The debts, the arrangements, the foreclosures. Clara nodded, her quiet wisdom finally given voice. Papa was a weak man, but Morrison made him weaker. Offered him games he couldn't win, loans he couldn't repay, choices that weren't really choices at all. Thunder shook the barn again, but this time it felt like nature adding its approval to their growing resolve. Sarah looked up from the letters, her sharp intelligence blazing with purpose. But he made one mistake. He assumed we were just 3 more desperate women with nowhere else to turn. Emma's hand found Jacob's in the flickering light, her touch conveying everything words couldn't express about trust and partnership, and the kind of love that grows not from desperation, but from recognition of shared strength. "We came here knowing we might be walking into a trap," she said, her voice carrying new authority born from choosing courage over safety. "But we also came knowing someone had to stop him." Outside, the storm raged with elemental fury, but inside Jakob's barn, 4 people stood united against forces that had seemed insurmountable just days before. Their combined will forged into something stronger than fear, more powerful than Morrison's calculated cruelty, more enduring than any empire built on the destruction of families and the exploitation of those with nowhere else to turn. Sunday dinner transformed Jakob's rough-hewn table into a war room where strategy tasted like Emma's perfectly seasoned roast, and hope flavored every word spoken in voices that had learned to harmonize through years of shared struggle. Emma carved meat with surgical precision, while her mind dissected Morrison's character with the same methodical care. Her gift for reading people's hidden motivations flowing like music through her observations. "He needs to feel superior," she said, passing plates with graceful efficiency. "Every interaction we've witnessed shows a man who believes his intelligence makes him untouchable, which means he'll underestimate us because we're women, because we're desperate, because he's done this so many times before." Sarah spread the incriminating letters across the table like a general mapping enemy territory, her mathematical mind calculating probabilities and timing with the precision of someone who had learned to survive by understanding patterns others missed. "The territorial magistrate arrives in Millfield on Thursday for monthly court sessions," she said, her ink-stained fingers tracing dates across correspondence. "If we can present evidence then, Morrison won't have time to destroy documents or intimidate witnesses." Clara listened to her sisters with the quiet intensity of someone who had spent a lifetime observing, gathering, understanding the subtle currents that moved beneath surface conversations. Mrs. Henderson mentioned Morrison's been pressuring the widow Jameson about her late husband's mining claim, she said softly, her voice carrying information gathered through careful attention to seemingly casual remarks. 3 other families received foreclosure notices this month, all with properties adjacent to the proposed railroad route. Jakob watched them work together, their individual brilliance creating something far more powerful than the sum of its parts, and felt his heart expand with recognition of something he had never imagined possible. Love that encompassed not just romantic attraction, but deep respect for the fierce intelligence and unshakable loyalty these women embodied. Emma's empathy revealed motivations, Sarah's logic found connections, Clara's observation uncovered secrets, and together they wove a strategy that could topple Morrison's carefully constructed empire. Their voices rose and fell in natural rhythm, interrupting each other to add crucial details, building on each other's insights with the seamless collaboration of people who had learned to think as one organism while maintaining their individual strengths. Jacob found himself leaning forward, drawn not just by Emma's beauty or Sarah's wit or Clara's wisdom, but by the way they transformed each other, made each other more than they could be alone, created a family unit so powerful that protecting it felt like the most important mission of his life. Lightning flickered through the windows, illuminating faces animated by righteous purpose. And Jacob realized he had fallen in love with something unprecedented, a complete family whose fierce devotion to each other had awakened his own desire to belong to something larger than his solitary existence, to protect something worth more than his individual survival, to become part of the synchronized strength that had carried 3 women through unimaginable hardship into his life, like a gift he had never known he desperately needed until this moment when everything changed forever. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Jacob's front yard when Morrison arrived with Sheriff Dalton and a leather portfolio that promised destruction, his confident stride announcing victory before the battle had even begun. Half the town followed at a respectful distance, drawn by the spectacle of respectable authority confronting whatever scandal had been brewing at the Brennan Ranch, their whispered conversations creating a chorus of anticipation that made the air itself seem to vibrate with tension. Morrison's polished boots clicked against the packed earth as he unfolded an official-looking document with theatrical precision, his voice carrying the weight of law and social order as he declared Jakob's marriage arrangement invalid under territorial statutes governing moral conduct and proper documentation. This property is hereby forfeit to cover outstanding debts and legal violations, he announced, his cold smile reflecting absolute certainty that 3 desperate women and 1 stubborn rancher could never challenge the machinery of power he had spent years constructing around his own greed. But Clara stepped forward with the quiet dignity of someone who had been underestimated her entire life, her voice carrying authority that made Morrison's sneer falter just slightly. "I am a certified teacher, Mr. Morrison, trained in legal documentation and territorial law at the Denver Women's Academy." Her words fell into the gathered crowd like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples of surprise that spread outward as she produced her own documents with the same theatrical precision Morrison had employed. "This marriage contract contains no violations of Territorial Statute 15-7 regarding matrimonial arrangements, and furthermore, your foreclosure documents reference debts that were fraudulently created through manipulation of gambling establishments you secretly own." Sarah moved to flank her sister, her mathematician's mind having spent days preparing for this exact moment, her ink-stained fingers steady as she unfolded ledgers that told the true story of Morrison's empire built on manufactured desperation. "Your books show payments to gaming houses in 3 counties, she said, her voice carrying the precision of numbers that never lied. "Payments that correspond exactly with debt creation for families whose land you later acquired through foreclosure proceedings." Emma stepped between her sisters, her gift for reading people now focused like a weapon on Morrison's increasingly pale face, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had finally found the courage to speak truth to power. "A woman's right to choose her own destiny is protected under territorial law, Mr. Morrison, and no man has the right to sell another human being to settle gambling debts, regardless of family relationship." The crowd pressed closer, sensing the shift in power dynamics as Morrison's confident authority crumbled under the weight of evidence he had never imagined these simple farm women could produce. Sheriff Dalton's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, but Mrs. Henderson's sharp intake of breath and old Pete's muttered curse created a wall of witnesses that made violence impossible. Morrison's sneer transformed into something desperate and dangerous as he realized his carefully constructed scheme had been systematically dismantled by 3 women he had dismissed as insignificant obstacles to his grand design of territorial domination through human suffering. The revelation detonated like dynamite when Clara produced Morrison's own handwriting. His personal correspondence spread across the afternoon sunlight like evidence of damnation written in his own careful script. "These are your letters to Judge Whitmore in Carson County," she said, her teacher's voice carrying across the gathered crowd with the authority of absolute truth, "detailing your plan to create artificial debt crises for families holding water rights along the proposed railroad corridor." Sarah stepped forward with ledgers that transformed numbers into weapons, her mathematical precision cutting through years of lies with surgical accuracy. "Falsified interest calculations, backdated loan documents, payments to gambling establishments that exist only on paper," she recited, each fact landing like a physical blow against Morrison's crumbling facade. $7,000 in manufactured debt across 43 families, all designed to force land sales at predetermined prices. Morrison's mask of respectability shattered completely as he lunged toward the documents, his voice rising to a roar that revealed the beast beneath his polished exterior. "You, interfering witches, will regret crossing me," he snarled, his hand reaching for the weapon Sheriff Dalton had suddenly made unavailable by stepping away from his supposed ally. But Jakob moved forward, with the fluid grace of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for, flanked by 3 women whose quiet strength had taught him that true power came not from domination, but from the courage to stand against those who would destroy others for personal gain. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Morrison's authority evaporated like morning mist, replaced by the solid presence of people who had chosen dignity over fear, truth over convenience, justice over the easier path of looking away from evil disguised as respectability. Emma lifted the final document with hands that trembled not with fear but with righteous fury, her voice carrying across the assembled townspeople with crystalline clarity. that made every word cut like glass through Morrison's last desperate attempts at denial. This letter, dated 6 days ago, and addressed to your associate in Denver, reads as follows. The triplet problem requires permanent solution before territorial magistrate arrives Thursday. Arrange appropriate accident during transport to Denver for territorial questioning. Her voice never wavered, despite the gasps of horror from Mrs. Henderson and the muttered curses from men who had finally understood the true scope of Morrison's evil. 3 women who had done nothing except refuse to be separated were scheduled to die because they posed an inconvenience to your plans. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Morrison's face went white as he realized his own correspondence had become the rope that would hang him in the court of public opinion long before any territorial magistrate could render official judgment. Sheriff Dalton's hand moved to his weapon, but this time it pointed toward Morrison rather than the people who had exposed him. The lawman's face, reflecting the shame of someone who had allowed himself to become complicit in corruption, that now stood naked before God and every decent person in Millfield County. Sheriff Dalton's weapon emerged from its holster with the metallic whisper of steel that had silenced too many voices across 3 counties. But this time the sound met something it had never encountered before. The absolute stillness of people who had finally seen evil clearly and refused to be moved by its threats. His partnership with Morrison blazed naked in the afternoon sun as his gun swung toward Jacob and the sisters, desperation replacing the confident authority that had cowed this community for years through carefully orchestrated fear. But Miss Henderson stepped forward first, her pearl-clutching propriety transformed into something fierce and unbreakable, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had spent decades watching injustice from the safety of silence. No. The word fell into the charged air like a stone thrown at a giant, and old Pete moved to flank her, his weathered hands empty, but his presence solid as granite. The miller's wife joined them, then the blacksmith, then families whose names Jacob barely knew but whose faces now reflected the same awakening he had experienced watching 3 women choose courage over safety, dignity over survival, truth over the comfortable lies that had allowed Morrison's empire to flourish in darkness. Clara's voice rose above the tension with the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the moment when ordinary people discovered their own extraordinary power. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be moved, she said, her teacher's wisdom carrying across faces that had been transformed by witnessing authentic courage in action. Her words rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat, and Jacob watched in amazement as neighbors who had whispered behind gloved hands now stood openly with the family they had watched fight for justice against impossible odds. The semicircle tightened around Morrison and Dalton with the inexorable pressure of water wearing away stone, each person who joined the silent wall, adding strength to those already committed to this unprecedented act of collective resistance. Morrison's face cycled through rage, disbelief, and finally the pale recognition of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him like a house built on sand. His threats had always worked before because they had been delivered to isolated individuals who faced his power alone. But now he confronted something his corruption had never prepared him to handle. An entire community awakened to their own strength, united by the example of 4 people who had chosen to stand together rather than be picked off separately. Dalton's weapon wavered as he realized that pulling the trigger would not restore their authority but would transform them from corrupt officials into murderers before dozens of witnesses whose silence could no longer be purchased or intimidated into compliance. The natural consequences of their years of exploitation had finally arrived in the form of people who had learned that evil only triumphs when good people choose comfort over conscience, safety over solidarity, whispers over the kind of open resistance that makes corruption impossible to sustain in communities where neighbors protect each other. Instead of looking away from suffering, they pretend not to see. Morrison's carefully constructed empire crumbled like ancient parchment touched by flame as families across 3 counties found their voices each testimony adding weight to the avalanche of justice that buried decades of systematic exploitation beneath the truth these three sisters had dared to speak first. The territorial magistrate arrived to find not one case of corruption, but a network of crime so extensive it required emergency legislation to address the scope of stolen land, falsified documents, and human suffering that had flourished in silence until Emma, Sarah, and Clara transformed whispered suspicions into documented proof that could not be ignored or intimidated into silence. Sarah's mathematical precision became the foundation for investigations that stretched from Denver to Santa Fe, her ledgers revealing patterns that helped other victims understand how their individual tragedies connected to Morrison's grand design of territorial domination through manufactured desperation. Within weeks, 43 families received legal notices that their foreclosed properties would be restored, their debts declared invalid, their faith in justice partially renewed by witnessing ordinary people accomplish what seemed impossible through coordinated courage and refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. The wedding took place at sunset on land that now belonged legally and spiritually to all four people whose lives had intertwined, like threads in fabric stronger than any individual strand could be alone. Emma wore her mother's dress, carefully mended by Sarah's skilled hands and decorated with wildflowers. Clara had woven into a crown that caught the golden light like a benediction from heaven itself. Jacob spoke vows that acknowledged not just his love for Emma, but his commitment to the complete family unit they had created through choice rather than convention, his words witnessed by neighbors who had learned to value love over social expectations, courage over comfort, truth over the easier path of looking away from others' suffering. Sarah and Clara stood as witnesses and permanent family members, their unconventional arrangement blessed by a community that had been transformed by watching four people choose dignity over desperation, cooperation over competition, moral courage over the safer path of individual survival. The ceremony occurred in Jacob's front yard, where Morrison had been defeated, the same space now consecrated by promises that honored both romantic love and the fierce loyalty that bound all four souls together in ways that transcended traditional definitions of marriage and family. As the sun painted the sky in shades of hope, their individual strengths wove together into something unbreakable. Emma's empathy, Sarah's intelligence, Clara's wisdom, Jacob's protective instinct, all combining to create a foundation strong enough to support not just their own happiness, but the ongoing work of ensuring no other families would suffer what they had endured. The resolution rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, proving that moral courage creates lasting change beyond immediate victory, inspiring other communities to recognize their own power, to protect the vulnerable, to stand against corruption, to choose the difficult path of justice over the comfortable silence that allows evil to flourish in darkness. Jacob stood on his porch in the early morning light, coffee steaming in his weathered hands as he watched three women who had transformed his understanding of what family could mean when built on chosen love rather than desperate necessity or social convention. 6 months ago, he had expected one quiet wife to share his solitary existence, but Emma, Sarah, and Clara had brought something infinitely more valuable, a revolutionary model of partnership that honored individual strength while creating collective power stronger than any force that had tried to break them apart. The train whistle echoed across the prairie, and Jacob smiled as he watched his family rush toward the station with the same synchronized grace that had first captivated him, their arms full of blankets, legal documents, and the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving Morrison's corruption and emerging stronger than before. The locomotive hissed steam like a dragon releasing new captives into the world. But this time the women who stepped onto the platform found not isolation and exploitation, but Emma's gentle strength offering shelter, Sarah's sharp intelligence providing legal protection, and Clara's quiet wisdom explaining the revolutionary idea that women could choose their own destinies rather than accepting whatever fate desperate men had arranged for them. Jakob watched his wife and sisters-in-law surround the newcomers with the kind of fierce protection they had once needed themselves, their voices weaving together as they explained options these women had never imagined existed. Legal recourse against fraudulent debt, community support for unconventional family arrangements, the radical concept that survival could be transformed into authentic thriving. When people refused to be isolated by those who profited from their desperation. The scene repeated variations of their own story as 3 more mail-order brides discovered they had allies instead of owners waiting for them, legal advocates instead of masters, a network of protection that had grown from one ranch house into something spanning 3 counties and inspiring communities across the territory to recognize their own power, to shield the vulnerable from predators like Morrison. Emma's gift for reading people now served to identify women at risk. Sarah's mathematical precision had become the foundation for territorial legislation protecting marriage arrangements from exploitation, and Clara's quiet observation skills helped other communities recognize patterns of corruption before they could take root and flourish in silence. Jacob marveled at how authentic power multiplied when shared with others who refused to be diminished, watching his family's influence ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves of change that transformed not just individual lives, but entire communities' understanding of what became possible when people chose cooperation over competition, protection over profit, love over the convenience of looking away from others' suffering. The camera of his memory pulled back to reveal the growing network they had built. Safe houses in 6 towns, legal advocates in every county courthouse, a telegraph system that warned communities about traveling predators, and, most importantly, the knowledge that no woman would ever again face Morrison's kind of calculated cruelty alone because 3 sisters had refused to be separated, and 1 man had chosen to protect something larger than his individual survival, proving that the most revolutionary act of all was simply refusing to accept injustice as inevitable when courage could transform it into lasting change.